These faraway islands inspired a lesson about nature that shook the modern world. It was a lesson about change. Now the islands might teach another great lesson, not about the ways of nature, but about the nature of man. This woman, Thuy de Roy, is a photographer, author, and conservationist. And this is her fragile world, Galapagos. Ancestors of the birds here were caught by ancient winds and swept out to sea. Animals were carried out on ocean currents from South America and Antarctica. They drifted on a vast expanse of Pacific, miraculously finding the 16 tranquil islands of the Galapagos, jutting up on the equator all alone, 600 miles from the nearest land, the coast of South America. They adapted, and over thousands of generations, their adaptations became lasting changes within species. They diverged from their ancestors. They became unique in all of nature. The great naturalist Charles Darwin, coming ashore here a century and a half ago, described it as a little world unto itself. What he saw here was a process of evolution so distinct it would lead him to a revolutionary breakthrough in man's understanding of nature. The Galapagos would be forever linked to the theory of evolution. The seeming perfection and serenity of the Galapagos, once called the Encantadas, Enchanted Islands, have attracted many visitors, including many of the world's great nature photographers. Thuy de Roy is one of the best, but she is not a visitor. This is her home, her world since her second birthday, when her parents arrived here on a Robinson Crusoe-like adventure. The islands have been her education. She knows them with a lifelong intimacy. Her love for them is heightened by the drama of their vulnerability. The creatures here are defenseless. They evolved in the absence of predators and never learned to protect themselves. They never learned fear. In their innocence, they were vulnerable when men came here, vulnerable when the animals men brought turned wild here, vulnerable today and in the future as the isolation of the islands ends and the modern world arrives. From time to time, Thuy de Roy takes her photos and her thoughts about conservation in the Galapagos and speaks out about her world to a very different world far away.
In January 1973, I had the opportunity to meet a teenage girl, and I was told that she was a wonderful wildlife photographer. I don't know how many times I've heard that over the years. The odds usually are they're not. That evening, we did a slide presentation for us, and I was absolutely overwhelmed. Here was a talent that most professional nature photographers would have killed for. I'm really proud to have had the chance to, quote, discover, unquote, her talents in far-flung Academy Bay. And I'm sure you're going to be astonished at some of the pictures she's going to show you this afternoon.
Man has not only stayed away from Galapagos in recent times, in modern times, but he's also been absent in the entire history of the island. So here we have an opportunity to see a place the way the world was created.
She is 33 years old. She has never been to school. Yet, she speaks 4 languages and has written a book praised as eloquent, filled with photographs praised as magnificent. She has traveled extensively to modern cities, but most of her life has been spent in the volcanic islands she describes as lost in time. In these remote islands, she is attracted by the most remote places, volcanic peaks, special places for her and her companion Mark Jones, an Englishman and fellow photographer who works as a Galapagos guide.
Alcedo volcano on Isabella Island is one of these really special places. It's only about 3,000 feet high, but it has an amazing amount of life in it. There's about 4,000 tortoises living on this volcano. It's probably the largest remaining populations of tortoises, and they're doing very well here. Use a reception. I think my pack is about to be tested.
This guy is curious.
Hey, what are you up to?
I think your pack's gonna go.
Now look what you did.
Tortoises are particularly amazing to me because they seem to do so many things that are vital to being a tortoise. They have all sorts of activities that are hard to explain for an animal that you'd expect doesn't do much thinking. There must be a lot more that goes on in the head of an animal like that than most people think. Look at that, he's sniffing the straps and everything.
This is a place that even many Galapagos natives have never seen. Getting here requires a boat ride, then a long, exhausting uphill hike in steamy heat. Alcedo is 30 miles below the equator. There's no fresh water. Campers must bring in their own water, and their stay is limited by how much of it they can carry. But the mornings are fresh and cool. Waking up here gives a sense of being the first of your kind, reaching a place no other human has seen. Twee's family explored the islands widely during her childhood, but didn't come to the peak of Alcedo until she was a teenager.
I came here for the first time with my dad when I was 15, and I think we both fell in love with the place at first sight, and my family and myself have been back here many, many times since then. Every time it's like coming back to an old haunt. You know what you're going to find, and it's there just as you expected. It's a good 5 or 6 hours just getting to the rim of the volcano. The crater is about 4 miles across, so it's more than a day just to get up to the rim and around the caldera and into the caldera floor where most of the tortoises live.
In early light, the giant tortoises look like rounded boulders, immobile as they sleep, slow as they awaken, oblivious to time. Their lifespan is a mystery. They live 100 years at least, maybe much more. These very tortoises may have been alive when Darwin came in 1835. They were the first creatures he encountered, and he was fascinated by them. Ancestors of these tortoises roamed much of the earth in primeval times. They existed in Texas 25,000 years ago. Now, these giant tortoises are extinct everywhere except one island in the Indian Ocean and here. The Spanish word for tortoises is Galapagos.
The tortoise does hold a real special feeling for me because it's such an ancient animal. You can really feel that it's been like that for such a long time. Not only do we know that tortoises roamed the world 500,000 years ago or more that looked almost identical to these, but you really feel that when you're amongst them. They're just going about their slow lives. They're carrying on just as they were last year and 10 years ago and 100 years ago. And that's what's so special about a place like Alcedo, where they're continuing to do this literally unchanged from times when perhaps we hadn't even learned how to be humans. This time of year is when the tortoises mate. You can hear them a long ways off as the males make the only sound that tortoises ever make. And a few months from now, the females will be laying their eggs. It takes the young about 4 to 6 months to hatch, and then they dig their way out to the surface. And this happens shortly before the new rains arrive next year. The males are the ones that reach the largest size. They're the ones that can reach 600 pounds in weight, whereas the females are quite a bit smaller. The endemic Darwin's finches have learned to eat ticks off the tortoises. And the tortoise respond to this by standing up in a very rigid position in order to allow the birds to have full access to get at the ticks. So it's really a mutually beneficial relationship where the tortoises get rid of annoying ticks and the finches get some rich food.
The giant tortoise is the symbol of the Galapagos, but it also is a symbol of vulnerability. Once they existed here packed together in such numbers that it was said a man could walk across their backs without ever touching the ground. But in the 1700s and 1800s, pirates and whaling ships stopped here to fill their holds with tortoises. Their meat is tasty and they can be preserved alive for months without food or water. Ships would take 400 or 500 of them at a time. Over the years, the loss mounted into the hundreds of thousands. Finally, there were so few left that ships no longer bothered stopping here. So the tortoises survived, escaping extinction. Today, the tortoise population of the Galapagos is about the same as the human population, around 10,000. All Galapagos life shares a Robinson Crusoe history. Cut off from the mainland, adapting, evolving into something different. So it is with the wildlife, and so it is with people, including Twee's family, coming here from Belgium in 1955. Living in Brussels after World War II, her parents were not content with European life. Her father, André, was an artist and craftsman, as was her mother, Jacqueline. Their dream was a different life, away from the estate where they worked as caretakers. Boldly, they boarded a freighter for the Galapagos. They lived at first in a tent atop a platform built on stilts to keep a safe distance from herds of wild cattle or pigs that often thundered below. They did not expect a life of ease and paradise, but they did find a life with nature. 2.5 years later came the birth of Thuy's brother Gilles, born without a doctor because in the Galapagos there were no doctors. Gilles is now a busy charter boat captain in the islands. Today, instead of a tent on stilts, Thuy's parents live in a handsome hillside home, modern yet simple, and built by their own hands over many years. Jacqueline and Andre, now in their early 60s, enjoy recalling the early days when they came here hardly knowing what they'd find, enduring rigors of primitive living that defeated friends who tried to follow them.
We had a lot of letters of people just saying, can we come and live the same life as you live? And it doesn't last long, 6 months, a year, and they just pack up everything and they leave because they cannot do it. They could not think about carrying water, providing firewood, going hunting and all. They are not prepared for that. And although they dreamt, they were dreaming a lot.
Personally, my only regret, something I've been carrying all the time and still feel, I have the impression to have started everything 10 years too late. I should have started 10 years earlier.
With the years, we were happy to find that we were living something so interesting here and going on discovery, and we helped. We had observed a lot of things, and we told the scientists all what it was about, and the children were all excited also, because when the scientist came and asked question, where do you think we can find this and that or so in marine life or on land, if they explained what kind of animal they were looking for, the children were the first one to go at sea and turn rocks and look for and collect, and then they came back and they shared.
Most people who grow up in an environment take it for granted, and I think I did that to some extent. I took it for granted in the sense that I didn't think about how unique it was, but I always enjoyed it. As far back as I can remember as a small child, there was always interest in everything around, and I'm sure that's what I caught on to.
Thuy was a little girl who knew what she wanted and what she didn't want. And I think from the very beginning, when she was 2 years old, I think we always looked at her and said, I think we cannot put a lot of things in her way. She knows what she wants.
Thuy said she wanted to have a good camera, and so I tried to discourage her. I say, there are so many professionals that come to the Galapagos.
Yes.
And each of them make thousands of pictures. I say, what do you hope to do? More pictures and to do better than they do? I found it really hopeless, and I just told it to Thuy, but she said, I want a camera.
When I was about 11 or 12, I started to see some of the seabird colonies and a lot of the bird nesting activities, and that got me really interested. I even remember one time when I said, I want to become an ornithologist, and then I began to realize what that meant, and it meant gathering of data or plucking feathers or putting bands, and I realized that wasn't at all what I was talking about. I was just interested in seeing what these birds do and how they go about doing it, and I decided right then that I was going to record all of the nesting behavior of all the birds in Galapagos, which seemed like a very simple goal then, and here I am 20 years later, and I still haven't finished that, but I think that's really what started me off on photography. I think it's more in retrospect that I began to realize that my childhood was special by comparison with other children's. Obviously, when I grew up here, I didn't spend any time pondering how the rest of the world was growing up, since I didn't have any contact with the rest of the world. I wasn't lonely or dreaming about faraway places. But it's only when I started to write and consider the rest of the world that I began to realize that this was a really special place.
With help from Mark, Thuy has been building a house of her own. Like her parents' home nearby, it is modern in design, but old-fashioned in spirit.
Well, one thing that we like about Galapagos life, and that applies to just about everything, the lifestyle in general involves a lot of self-sufficiency, you need something, you do it. You don't rush out and buy it or contract someone else to do it for you, especially with a project like house building. If you want it done the way you want to see it, then you do it yourself, and that's exactly what we're doing. A lot of our lifestyle also involves not so much working for money, but working to avoid spending money, doing things that shortcut the system.
Probably the most famous Galapagos birds are the Darwin's finches, so named because they perfectly demonstrate evolutionary principle. The finches are small, drab, and common-seeming, but they've evolved highly specialized functions to adapt to the island's environment. There's a finch with a bill made for eating soft seeds, another with a bill for crushing hard seeds. Others are adapted for eating cactus or catching insects. They are humble-seeming birds, but impressive and friendly.
Look at that, we've got 3 different species here. 4 different species. Got a pair of cactus finches, got a couple of medium ground finches, large ground finch over there, and there's a small ground finch sitting in the tree. Of course, ground finches sit in trees and tree finches sit on the ground. You have to remember that. There's nothing ever so simple as a well pigeonholed rolls. There's been a lot of work done to show that the finches feed on different things and that their feeding habits keep them from getting to be in competition. But as you can see here, they don't mind sharing whenever the opportunity arises. It's a neat relationship because the finches aren't really dependent on us, and yet when they're not nesting, they'll come and sit here by the hundreds. They're very much a part of my life here. I can remember when I was quite small, they came around the house, but we didn't actually have any tame ones. And I started to really try to get them to come to my hand, and the first ones were very hesitant, and then it caught on. I guess they just got bolder and bolder when they saw that it was worth it. And we've had tame finches ever since.
Twee's home overlooks Academy Bay, the island's commercial center. When her family arrived here in the 1950s, contact with the outside world was an old supply ship that came twice a year. Today, the bay is busy with the yachts that sail this part of the Pacific, and there is a town to visit on regular shopping trips. The Galapagos are a province of Ecuador. There's a small clinic here, but the seriously ill are flown to the mainland. There's still no telephones. In the old days, most jobs were in fishing and agriculture, but today, tourism is the major employer. There are several no-frills hotels, a dozen or so restaurants, a few bars. What nightlife there is ends at midnight when the town's generator is turned off. The fan in your hotel room starts whirring again when power comes back at 6 a.m. To visitors, the outside world has barely arrived. To longtime residents like Twee, it is already altering a way of life.
No one thinks of Robinson Crusoe spending half the morning getting a pitcher of milk and bringing it back in his dinghy and having to boil it to sterilize it, and that's all part of the life here. The romantic aspect of Robinson Crusoe still holds true perhaps, but the vast majority of the activities that are involved in the life here are more down to earth.
In recent years, Twee has become something of a tourist attraction herself. Tourists are sometimes invited to her parents' house to meet her and buy copies of her book and photos.
Come on in, everybody. It's cooler inside.
Well, today was
Stamps are great. The booby stamp's wonderful.
Thanks. Without the plastic? Because this is
Have you got your autograph on that?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It's right there.
Okay, fine. Oh, marvelous. Just marvelous. She's one of the great people as far as environmental work is concerned. Yeah, we really enjoyed it. And exciting to be here. She seems so unassuming. Almost shy. That's she got. Yeah.
That's one of those autofocus cameras.
Oh, and I just love those pictures.
Right.
My son gave me Tui's book, and I was just thrilled with it. He wrote in the front that he appreciated all I'd done for him in teaching him in high school, and he also appreciated the fact that I had given him a better understanding of evolution. And the front cover, the picture on the front, there's a small bird there, and he says, that's me, and the other ones are you and my mother teaching me.
Yeah, the more I read your book, the more upset I got that we weren't going to Isabella. I was like, oh no, you know, I have to come back.
She's got to come back to spend a week just on Isabella.
so,
Okay, ciao.
and maybe you have an eruption.
Hi, thank you.
For all its comforts and obligations, life in town only keeps Twee away from what she loves most, getting out to the islands. Under motor power, travel between the islands is a pleasure. Distances between islands range from a few miles to about 100. No trip takes more than a day. But in the old days, sailing between the islands was an ordeal. Strong currents or lack of wind often prevented sailing ships from landing and sometimes created the illusion that it was not the ships but the islands themselves that were drifting. There are accounts of vessels drifting offshore for days, their crews sweltering in equatorial heat, yet unable to get ashore for fresh water. Traveling between islands is the only way to see the diversity of Galapagos life. Each island is different. Species of one island have evolved differently from those of the next. For Twee, this is where her work as a photographer blends with her fulfillment as an observer of nature.
Punta Vicente Roca has to be one of my favorite places in Galapagos because it's so very wild. It's almost never visited. The blue-footed boobies come in vast numbers here. The boobies are the most prominent right now because they're just starting to nest and beginning their courtship. You can hear them constantly. The females are honking and the males are whistling. They're going through a lot of sky pointing where the male flips its wings up, wings and tail and beak, all pointing skywards, and whistles. The whole courtship of the boobies seems to revolve around those incredible blue feet. They really show them both dancing around in slow motion, and when they come in with that landing stunt where they throw their feet up and expose the undersoles, it really must be quite spectacular from the mate's point of view on the ground. This colony doesn't have much in the way of natural predators, but there's a problem here with the feral cats. The wild cats are very abundant on this island. They come around the booby colony and frequently steal eggs, and it just totally baffles me how they manage to do that. I've seen them eating fresh eggs that they've just carried away from the colony, and yet whenever the cats come near the boobies ward them off quite effectively with just jabbing towards them with their beaks, and the cats run off. It's really incredible to look into the way they feed. You'll see them flying along maybe 50 or 100 feet over the sea, and all of a sudden they just drop out of the sky, and not only do they drop, but they actually fly downwards to add speed, and then at the very last moment before they hit the surface, they extend their wings behind their body and just enter the water like an arrowhead. Their whole life cycle when they're nesting depends on making many short trips to feed and coming back in to feed their young. Once or twice I've seen a colony where all of a sudden the fish will move away for some reason, and they can no longer make the trips necessary to come in and feed the young. And so rather than try and feed their young and perhaps starve in the process, they just desert the nesting area, and this can happen almost overnight. That way the adults can survive, and a few months later they come back and start again when the conditions are better. So it's a harsh but very effective way of being able to raise just as many chicks as possible under varying conditions. Tower Island is one of those remarkable places because it's so isolated. It's an outpost, really. It's the northeasternmost island in Galapagos, and as a result it attracts vast numbers of seabirds that roam the oceans. The red-footed boobies are in full nest-building mood right now. They usually fly off from the nest spot and go some distance away and break off some branches off some bushes, and then come back into the nest and present the twig to their mates. A lot of the time they drop their twigs, they fumble a little bit or whatever, and the branch falls down and ends up on the ground. And it's neat to see how they learn that if you pick up those twigs and hold them up for them, they can recycle them, I guess. And after 2 or 3 twigs, they're actually looking out and waiting for the next one to be handed up. Look at him follow. A lot of these seabirds are totally oblivious to people. That's one of the greatest experiences, just to sit here and be disregarded. They just carry on as if we weren't here.
Should we put you back? Because you're going to try and get yourself one.
Yeah, I'm going to try and get myself one. But then again, the young ones are often curious. They have time to spend, they have a lot of things to learn about life, and part of this learning process is to get to know what the other creatures around them are, and I guess we fit the bill as being other creatures.
Just follow my fingers now. There he is.
Tourism is a relatively recent thing in Galapagos. It only started in about 1970, and it's grown quite a bit in that time with the beginning of the flights coming out to Galapagos. First they were coming once a week and then twice weekly, and now there's 6 days a week. And I think tourism in Galapagos has really been a very positive thing. The National Park in the mid-70s had to put in a number of little trails, establish visitor sites and mark the nature trails. And in that way, tourists have been able to see the maximum amount of the wildlife activity in Galapagos and at the same time do virtually no damage. And really, tourism, I think, is one of the strongholds, one of the foundation posts of the conservation work in Galapagos. I think most Ecuadorians nowadays are very proud of Galapagos because of what it represents to the world. Tourism is what has constantly reinforced the fact that Galapagos is an important element in the world. At the end of the warm season, around March, April, May, the frigate birds especially are in full courtship display. They have this enormous great pouch that they inflate under their beaks, and they can pump it up in about 20 minutes or half an hour and put on this incredible display that attracts the females. The males just perch in the bushes and flutter their wings and inflate the pouch, and the females come overhead and pass back and forth and inspect the colony and somehow decide that one male is more dazzling than another. To me, they certainly all look dazzling, but the females are very, very choosy.
This is Tagus Cove on Isabella Island, a famous Galapagos anchorage. Pirate ships using the Galapagos as a hideout used to sail in here. Whaling ships came too, their crews getting a rare glimpse of land in Pacific voyages that lasted 4 or 5 years. Whalers and other sailors left their mark, nautical graffiti, dates, and names of ships. A more serious mark was the devastation caused by mainland animals that arrived on visiting ships. Domestic animals turned wild here: dogs, cats, goats, horses, rats, burros. They destroyed vegetation and killed wildlife, driving whole species into extinction. They were the first predators in a place that had never known predators and had no natural defenses against them. The worst enemy of the island's vegetation was the goat, a few of them multiplying into the thousands, capable of ravaging whole islands.
There's been several campaigns to eliminate goats on various islands. The national park has been successful in killing goats off of a number of the smaller and medium-sized islands, and their goal is eventually to remove the goats even from the larger ones.
That's cool.
From a personal point of view, and for my family as far back as I can remember, the presence of goats was always quite a boon. I grew up with goat meat on the table. My dad used to go hunting once or twice a week and bring back goats, and we still do. It's, of course, sometimes a bit of a strange feeling to be out there tracking down and hunting an animal which, even though it's destructive to the island's ecosystem, it's still a rather beautiful animal with its own life to lead.
In 1959, a sense of alarm about the future of the islands brought about two important conservation measures. The internationally funded Charles Darwin Research Station was established, and the government of Ecuador declared 97% of the islands a national park, off limits to private development, with strict restrictions on tourists. Tourists must have permits and guides, and must be off all protected islands by sunset. Nowadays, it's said that island wildlife is better protected from man than from animal predators. To counter the predator damage, the Park Service and Darwin Station embarked on a program of captive breeding, taking in hundreds of tortoise and iguana eggs, hatching them, and raising the young until they're big enough to have a better chance in the wild.
Chiquito que es.
Sí. A veces nace pegado aquí.
¿Ah, sí?
Sí.
Queda pegado
Hay
en
que
el huevo.
despegarles
En la yema.
para que ayudarles a nacer a veces.
Sí. They're so cute when they're so small. The details are much greater. Little tiny needle-sharp claws that they use to dig out of their nests. Doesn't like being held up. There you go. Skin is still thin. He's going to be another 2 weeks or so inside the incubator before he would normally come out into the light. He's a little bit dazzled just now, because they often spend a month or 6 weeks inside their nest before they actually make their way to the surface when they have to dig out. Esto entonces se queda allí otro,
Sí, unos 15 días más.
mes o
Un mes
A
más.
total of about 1,000 tortoises and iguanas have been returned or repatriated, always to their original islands to keep native species intact. Of all the creatures at the Darwin Station, one is a celebrity, an emblem for conservation and a reminder of the vulnerability of species. Of the 14 races of giant tortoise that have evolved in the Galapagos, he is a Pinta Island tortoise. The race was thought to be extinct until he was found. The problem is that no others were found. This tortoise, named Lonesome George, is one of a kind.
He's a young male in his prime, so to speak. He's got a couple of lady friends in his pen with him just to make sure he doesn't get too lonely, but he doesn't like them. He doesn't want to have anything to do with them. So he's lonesome, and that's what he's meant to be, I guess, Lonesome George.
He may live for 100 or more lonely years, representing a race's last moment before extinction. Unless a mate is found, his race is doomed.
I think Fernandina Island, and more specifically Cape Douglas, is one of those places that will always remain my favorite maybe in the whole world, just because it is so untouched, so wild. You feel that there's really a basic understanding between all these living creatures, including ourselves. We're not man as a different entity from the rest of the wild world, but we're part of the natural world. They accept us, and of course this gives incredible opportunities for photography, but I think it's even more moving just to watch them, just to see how they relate to us and how they try to understand, just like we try to understand them. Curiosity seems to be such an ingrained thing with so many animals. It seems really surprising. You sometimes think that curiosity is mostly a human trait, and yet the way baby fur seals come up to people to check them out, or they go up and check out other things. You see them go up to a bird, go up to a booby and check it out, and then the booby goes and checks out the fur seal. It really doesn't matter whether it's a human, a bird, or a mammal, a reptile. Curiosity is such a widespread trait, and there seems to be no real good explanation for it. It's just a feeling. The Sally Lightfoot crabs are quite abundant. They feed on seaweed and also on debris from any other animals that might be feeding on fish or whatever. So you see them continuously walking along the edge of the water or on the wet rocks, picking up little particles, little bits of seaweed as they walk along and stuffing them in their mouth. The penguins are really amazing in that it's such an alien environment for a penguin. The Galapagos penguin is the only one that actually is found on the equator. Not all penguins live on snow and ice, but they all tend to live in cold environments, and here they are on black lava in the tropical sun. Of course, the water is quite cold around Fernandina Island, which is where they normally live. They nest in these deep caves, and they're mostly active in the evening. Galapagos hawks each have a territory, a mile or two maybe of coastline. The yearlings come around and they'll follow you up and down the coast. They even come into camp and pick up things. They sometimes carry off socks or shoes or anything loose they can find. The flightless cormorant is one of a number of unique species to Galapagos that are found nowhere else in the world. It has completely reduced wings, totally flightless, and tremendously powerful feet for swimming and hunting, stalking their prey underwater. It's believed that a small population of ordinary cormorants came to Galapagos at some point, and because the food supply was abundant and stable near shore, they eventually didn't need to fly any great distances, and as a result they became heavier and developed greater abilities for diving and lost their ability to fly in the process. The marine iguana is actually the only lizard in the world that's evolved to depend on the ocean for food. And there's a lot of speculation as to why this happened in Galapagos and nowhere else, and there really isn't a good answer to that. You can find thousands and thousands of them in great masses all together, sunning themselves along the shore. When the tide goes down, all these iguanas move down towards the water's edge and start to feed on the algae in the intertidal zone. And a lot of them also go into the water and swim some distance offshore. They don't actually use their legs for swimming, but they use their tail. They undulate their tail, which is flattened, and dive down and just graze the algae off the rocky bottom. It's like cows in a pasture, but underwater. It's a most incredible sight to see these iguanas. They look very pale, grayish underwater, and they just cling to the rocks and graze away. In the last few decades, the Galapagos ecosystem has drawn a lot of attention around the world because it's so unique and so special on land, but I think very few people realize just how unique it is underwater. It's every bit as special underwater, and in many cases even more so. The entire shoreline of Fernandina is an excellent example. All these animals that we see here, the iguanas and birds, all the vast amount of life that borders the shoreline is all dependent on the sea. And if anything were to happen to the marine environment, all of this life on land would disappear as well. And it's only recently that there's more and more interest in trying to preserve the marine environment and actually extending the status of national park to the marine environment. There's several species of whales that frequent the waters around here. These are Bridie's whales. They are medium-sized whales, usually very shy, very hard to approach. This is really unusual to have them so close and totally oblivious to our boat. That's, of course, what's the most rewarding thing about the natural world in general. When you're in a truly wild place, it seems that everything is always unpredictable.
So far, conservation in the Galapagos is a success story. Worldwide opinion supports it. Ecuador has acted with pride and foresight. And yet, resources are limited, funds are limited, and resolve might prove limited if and when powerful commercial or political interests focus on the islands. The Galapagos are a state of innocence, a place that evolved without fear. But now man has inextricably entered the evolutionary picture here. What happens will be a test of man's relationship with nature. Is the modern world's arrival a foretaste of ruin? Or will man's impulse to be nature's master be tamed by this tamest of places? Can man learn its lessons of balance and humility?
It's really a pretty morning. I love it when the clouds are low like that and just kind of hanging and moody. I feel that I'm fortunate in that I can be independent. I intend to remain independent and always choose to lead a lifestyle where I can build in the time, the flexibility to look around and appreciate these subtle things around me wherever I am. and sees the opportunity to try and bring a few people around to that kind of viewpoint, that way of looking at the world. I think the world could become a better place if enough people were a little bit more attuned to what's around them. It doesn't really matter where you live or where you go. If you are going to feel the natural world and natural balances really mean something to you, it's everywhere.
I'm Peter Burley, president of the National Audubon Society. The government of Ecuador has acted wisely to protect the Galapagos as a biological shrine for all humankind. As a result, this fragile chain of islands hopefully is preserved forever for science and for the enjoyment of people worldwide. The saga of the Galapagos is one of our great environmental success stories. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for numerous other natural wonders throughout the world. Human development and population pressures are threatening a variety of irreplaceable wildlife habitat, from the tropical forests of Brazil to the Arctic wilderness of Alaska, from Kenya's Serengeti Plain to America's Chesapeake Bay. The National Audubon Society is working to meet this global challenge through a wide range of citizen action, scientific and educational programs nationwide. If you want to join us in this ongoing battle, write me, Peter Burley, at the National Audubon Society, 950 3rd Avenue, New York, 10022, or call 1-800-832-7246.